Father, we thank you for the opportunity, as always, to come and to learn, and especially today we start thinking about being tired or fatigue and different reasons, different causes, but help us always to take an evaluation of spiritually the temptations that come through all of the various methods and situations and circumstances. But in all of it, help us to have an honest appraisal of ourselves as we seek to live for you and to be pleasing to you in everything. That is the goal, to be obedient and to honor you and to glorify you. So we ask you for your blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, letter 30, here we are. And it's interesting how you kind of see C.S. Lewis in his writings that he kind of spent some time rehearsing some of the things that he's brought up prior in greater detail. So we'll see a couple of those. But the title I put on here, which is just kind of random, is well, not too random, but The Temptations of Fatigue and Discerning What is Real. And we've seen a little bit of both of those prior. We'll talk about that. Any initial thoughts on this letter that spoke to you?
That you're supposed to read.
That you're supposed to read it?
Before you got
In
here.
advance.
We'll wait till the second to last one to
Oh.
read it before class.
Jerry, as I said, read.
I was too tired.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I read it sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yes.
Okay.
And honestly, you know, the thing about all of these letters is just the way that his particular style is in these is, you could give this to a fifth grader, and they would read it, and they'd go, oh, well, he talked a lot of things about being tired and this and that, and then you get like this surface layer of meaning, and which again is there, but then when you start getting into the sentences and the words and the paragraphs, it's just like three-dimensional for you. You start going, oh, I see all these facets that come, and so that's kind of our goal. So let's just jump in. Again, I like that we're getting towards the end. Is next we'll be on this for 2 weeks, but the next letter is it, and then the patient dies in the next letter, and I like the way that he addresses that, and it's interesting in the sense of the closure. But what do we have here? What do we know? The patient has a little bit of anxiety and worry and concern because his neighborhood is getting bombed by the Germans. So he says, so then, dear Wormwood, I sometimes wonder whether you think you have been sent into the world for your own amusement. I gather not from your miserably inadequate report, but from that of the infernal police, that the patient's behavior during the first raid has been the worst possible. He has been very frightened and thinks himself a great coward, and therefore feels no pride, but he has done everything his duty demanded and perhaps a bit more. So, a couple things here is, way back, I gave you guys the introduction that I had written about all the different department heads in the book, and one of them was the infernal police, which I think is just kind of fun. But one of the questions is right in the beginning, he makes this comment, you think you've been sent in the world for your own amusement. And one of the questions I have here is, what were the so-called, what is the goal of the enemy? What is his purpose in that sense?
Make us ineffective.
Make us ineffective, absolutely. What else? How does the enemy come?
Unbalanced.
What?
To make us unbalanced.
I think that's really the key. I see that more and more as I get older and looking at the spiritual life is unbalanced. And you really look at, give me, if you can, a single heresy that exists that doesn't have part of its description as being unbalanced. I mean, really, you just pick out a heresy. You think, oh, well, Jesus isn't God. Well, what's that focusing on? How is it unbalanced? Well, he's fully human. Well, he is fully human. He's also God. And so you look at any sort of, I see this most of the time what you have, and I'll talk about this a little later, but you have a disproportionate or unbalanced emphasis on maybe one aspect of God's character and not the other.
Or location.
Okay?
I just researched somebody that I ran into who is House of Yahweh, and I've never heard of it before. Some interesting stuff. Very imbalanced, and it's to exclude everybody else because we are the only ones that have a certain.
Of course,
thing.
yeah.
Very interesting.
And yet we know that the gospel, by definition, excludes people, right?
But anybody can come to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to live certain places and do certain things.
Right.
And come to Jesus.
It's interesting that whether it's the Mormon Church or Jehovah's Witnesses that have, let's say at the most, I'll be very generous, 20 million people in their particular brand of religion. There's 20 million people that are saved, all the rest aren't going to make it, okay? Out of 7.4 billion. Now, we see in Luke 13 that somebody comes up to Jesus and says, Lord, are there going to be few who are saved? And this was in the same context of Jesus speaking about the broad road and the narrow road, and broad is the way leads to destruction, narrow is the way, and few that find it. And they're hearing his teaching, and they ask him, are there few who are saved? And he responds with an affirmative, because people choose that. So again, we do understand that the gospel's open. I mean, people can come in that sense, but there are a few that end up going on the narrow road. But then you take it out of balance, and now you have 15 million LDS or whatever at the expense of everybody else, and really, and then you can go to something like that where it's even smaller, and you see it in some of these churches, very sometimes extremely fundamental churches. You go, so you guys are the only one, right? Like, I mean, you 40, that's it in the whole world.
I thought it's 144,000.
Yeah,
Well, that's the J Dubs.
Okay.
Well, and that's even there. That's only there's other people that are saved, but those are the special. Pardon?
The 40 is the Hillsborough Baptist.
Right. So we have an imbalance oftentimes in theology. What about an imbalance in the spiritual life? What does that look like? I was talking about this. It might be a good opportunity to bring it up because, again, when he's correcting him, saying you've been set in the world for your own amusement, but we need to say, well, what has Satan been, and all the demons and all the enemy, that whole camp, whatever that looks like. Their goal is to deceive. Their goal is to make us ineffective. Their goal is to corrupt us spiritually. The goal is to keep us from knowing Jesus, first of all, to blind the mind or whatever. And but what are some other ways in the spiritual life that
the extremes, like fasting and beating yourself
Yeah.
down, and
Flagellation,
you think
right?
of the Middle Ages and some of the locking yourself in a cell and never speaking and never going out of your cell, because that would be spiritual, or today's spirituality that Jesus wants me healthy, wealthy, and wise.
Yeah.
And so
Oh, yeah.
if I'm not enjoying it, well then it can't be God's will. If I don't really enjoy this wife, well I can dump her, and if God's not giving me enough money, I should do something healthy, wealthy, and wise, and I got to have fun. It's got to be
the prosperity
yeah,
teaching.
and it's got to be fun. Jesus came that I might have abundant
Yeah.
life, and
Jesus wants me happy.
if I don't have a bigger house, I won't be happy. So I should get the bigger house and put every penny that I have into that.
So you see theologically there, because I remember this being in the the first church I was ever at was a really strong Pentecostal church, and gospel, prosperity gospel on TBN, all of it, and the pastor would always say, John 10:10, I've come to give them life, and life what?
More abundantly.
More abundant. And so, and that's a true statement, isn't it? Jesus
Right.
said it.
Right.
Okay.
But
But you start going, well, what happens if Jesus' definition of abundant is different? Because we tend to think of abundance, and I think we fall into the trap too, of going, oh, he's really blessed. Well, what do you mean by that?
it's got stuff.
He's got stuff.
Lots of it.
Especially in American. So the other thing too is we see this word, where we get in the practical, and it's worth a little tangent. How do we define this?
Rules.
Okay.
Regulation.
Rules that equal righteousness.
Okay.
Or lead to righteousness.
All right. There's a goal there. Okay. Works. That's good.
Law. That's what legal is.
Okay. Law. That's good. What kind of law?
Religious
Like Old
law.
Testament law?
A lot of it they do. Some
Okay.
people, some now modern
Other
times,
ones?
there's different rules.
Using biblical phrase, the traditions of men, right? Matthew
Or
15.
exclude the Old Testament because now we're in the New Testament.
So-
how do you hold that against, kind of like advice as far as spiritual disciplines?
Right.
Have spiritual disciplines
Okay.
without legalism.
Jerry's getting in there. Spiritual disciplines. So,
There's a
what I look at this is, to me, I like to look at it in three categories. And one is, I would say salvation, that maybe like a works righteousness. This would be Acts 15, or I would say Galatianism, if you wanted to look at it like that, where they were trying to add circumcision and the Old Testament into salvation. The second thing would be like, well, let's talk about this first. So, legalism would be like that. Hey, unless you keep kosher, you keep the Old Testament law, you cannot be saved. And we would say, hey, that's very legalistic in the sense of, again, Galatianism and adding. It would be basically it's faith plus works. And as we know, anything faith plus nothing is Jesus, but faith plus works equals salvation.
Having a specific spiritual gift.
Okay, that's the next one.
Oh, okay.
No, but I'm glad. So the next one is a Romans 14 issue, where now we're getting into what Jerry was bringing up, in that the spiritual life, these here what they're doing is they're taking the secondary beliefs or values, and they're making the secondary ones primary. All right. So we look at, again, obedience is good, but we're saying, well,
If you don't have the faith and the works, then you're not.
Correct.
And then you're not saved.
and yet we know, again, there's a balance. Why? Because faith without works is dead, right, James 2? So here, these are the, like I would call these liberties. So, for example, you have some people that say, well, your spirituality is affected if you have a drink of alcohol. Okay? This is Romans
Have a
14.
drink of alcohol.
You have a drink of alcohol. It's like,
Okay.
you're not quite as spiritual as me, because now we're taking these other liberties and we're putting them in. And so now spiritual disciplines. Well, if you don't pray the way that I pray 5 days a week, 1 hour a day, or whatever, however it is, now all of a sudden you're coming in and we would say, hey, that's legalism in the sense of you bringing these, and this would probably be even third level, these spiritual disciplines of maybe keeping the Sabbath or eating specific foods, and what they're trying to replace or trying to add that in a different way to how you live your life. So we might say, hey, you're being legalistic up here, the Galatianism, in adding faith plus works. Now it's about living life, the spiritual life, if you wanted to say it that way. And third, I think what you hear often is, this is not really a theological construct, but in the sense of what we really mean is you're being judgmental. Like, for example, you go to somebody and they're living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and you say, hey, you need to repent of this. This is clearly disobedient. And what do they say? Quit being so legalistic.
Stop judging me.
Stop judging me. And they'll throw this term around because nobody wants to be legalistic. The church has done, the evangelical church has done a great job of talking about faith plus nothing. But then this word gets thrown around down to here into this judgmental, and we go, wait, that's not really even what the term means. So this is a great example of Screwtape coming in and trying to make us ineffective or bring confusion or bring us out of balance.
Another thing I'm thinking about too is through the charismatic movement, if you don't speak in tongues, you must not be really saved.
Yeah,
And
so
you
that's-
had to do it, and it's not true.
It's not true.
No.
So they're adding these other things, or you don't have the Spirit, or whatever else,
Right.
in a variety of things. But again, I was talking to somebody this weekend. I was like, that's a good thing to bring up, because oftentimes we see this word thrown around. We don't all. And the person was saying, "Well, we need to have a biblical definition." And I said, "Well, what's the biblical definition?" The word doesn't appear in the Bible. The theology does, but the word itself, and that's why I say Galatianism, because you do see it there primarily in them trying to add something, and Paul is really upset. It ends up being a false gospel in that sense. So let's keep moving here. He says, I like this, that he says he has been frightened, thinks himself a coward, and feels no pride. Okay, so in this particular, this goes along with what we saw in letter 14, that even though he thinks himself a coward, the consequent is he's humble. Okay, and that's according to letter 14, or lack consistency. But he has done everything his duty demanded, and perhaps a bit more. Now, I want to read something that, again, this comes back to letter 8. And this particular paragraph is something that I think about often, coming out of the Screwtape letters, just in my own thinking. And this is where, if we go back, remember the law of undulation? Up and down, spiritual low points, high points. And so, here is this, just listen here. It says, hence, the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please God best. We can drag our patients along by continual tempting, because we design them only for the table, and the more their will is interfered with, the better. God cannot tempt to virtue as we do vice. He wants them to learn to walk, and must therefore take away his hand. If only the will to walk is really there, he is pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Now here's the key. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, he looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, but still obeys. And so here, I think, you ever been there?
Yes.
Yep.
We we look around, where in the world is God at in all this? I feel abandoned. I don't even desire to obey, but I'm going to. And Screwtape says, oh man, if we get there, the cause is almost lost. Now why is that?
I believe.
So belief, it's really believing in the Lord.
It's faith, right?
Yeah.
And faith, as he said, in the midst of the dryness, the drought, faith, which produces, faith will, if we were to do it right, we know scripturally that faith produces works, right? It's not faith and works.
Right.
But faith, in that moment, that produces obedience, is just, think about that. It blows everything out of the water in the sense of happiness. Well, fine, God provided me.
You're at the end of yourself, and because of your faith, you turn to God to just survive day to day, and
Well, why obey in that moment? God has
because your knowledge is that if you obey Him, through that you have your salvation is by obedience.
It's darkest just before the dawn.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Yeah. I've been there several times.
He gets in that in the next, at the end of this letter.
If I just wait another day, I see him everywhere.
Yeah.
I think of the scripture, where else am I going to go?
That's one of my
Honestly,
favorite passages, John 6.
Yeah.
Because that is, if you know it to be true, you know it's true, and you can deceive yourself to go somewhere out of your pain for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But if you
Yeah.
actually know that it's true and you're really saved, there is nowhere else for you to
That's
go.
right.
Let's talk about that because it comes up in the sense of, and we'll see it here in. I don't know if he says it here. Oh, he says it a little bit later. But I love the consistency with what we do here and then how it ends up in the sermon because when you say you know, are you talking about what you've experienced or
That
what you
helps.
have felt?
It's a combination of everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, it's faith, which
Yeah.
is a gift
Yeah.
from God to believe what He has revealed. And so knowing is a faith, and you do have emotions with it, and you do have experience with it, and you have seen His faithfulness, like when
Yeah.
things come through. So you have that kind of experience base to pull from,
And
as
choosing.
well as the saints that He's given
Sure,
us to
sure.
look at. And so knowing, for me, it's a combination.
So yeah, these are part of the package. Don't want to deny that.
But they're not all there is to it.
No.
Draw my little triangle up there.
I have it. I like that triangle too because what's missing here? I mean, we're just started, but you mentioned, hey, this is what I know.
And choice. I keep coming back to when you choose what you have.
Okay.
You've been through
So we can-
stuff,
we can put
and
this
you
over
find
here.
out that God's
Choices.
really faithful, and
Yeah.
and you choose to keep on keeping on because you know He's done what He's done for you
Okay.
before.
Reason.
Are you kind of thinking, it goes on the line of experiential, but, I mean, you can look back and see how God's come through for you
Well,
Yeah.
before
yeah,
and
that's
again,
experience.
and
We're not
again,
denying
and
experience.
So it's
Yeah.
like spiritual guideposts, I've heard them say.
ultimately,
So it gets deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
what do we know?
Scripture.
It's
Scripture.
His word.
It comes down. This is the most important thing. Not that these aren't included,
Right.
because our experiences interact with truth, our feelings interact with truth.
Yeah.
But ultimately, especially here, with reading that, is when we come to that situation, we're not feeling like obeying. We're not desiring that. In fact, we feel abandoned. And our experience is it plays in, but there might be a sense where our experience can deceive us and trick us because we say, well, last time I trusted, it ended up becoming worse. Has that ever happened?
Yeah.
It does. We think, oh, I see what God's doing here, and God says, no, you really don't. And then it ends up sometimes getting worse. And this is what he's going to talk about a little bit later, is we set ourselves up with these expectations of what God is or isn't doing. And that's what Screwtape is encouraging. Create this just a little bit of an expectation so that when it doesn't happen the way that we wanted it or expected, really hoped, whatever, and I would say really hoped, expected, and ultimately what we wanted. That's the biggest thing. And it doesn't happen, we become disappointed. Because if I asked, how many of you have ever been disappointed in God?
A little bit. Just a little.
Right? Yeah, I mean, we all would. We'd say, and we don't want to say it because has God ever disappointed you? And we go, well, what's the definition? I felt disappointed, but that's a real thing. Not only felt, but I was disappointed. God did disappoint me, but that's only because I put my expectations out there above His will, right? And so we feel this and we go, but in reality, I guess it's a subjective thing. Has God ever disappointed you?
Maybe disappointed so much as difficult. Difficult situation.
Yep. I mean, the definition of disappointment is to have an expectation not realized, right?
Yeah.
And we've all had that. But then you go back to the premise and say, well, should I have had those expectations anyway? And that's when humbly we go, probably not. Okay? So, what we're coming out is, what we're going to see is this truth. And when we get into those situations here, notice that he thinks himself a coward. He's been humbled because he hasn't felt he's been brave enough or courageous enough or whatever. And therefore, Screwtape Wormwood's going, man, I don't have any pride on him. But he has done everything his duty demanded. Now this is the key. The key here is duty. We've talked about that before. We talked about Luke 17, 7 through 10, where what is our duty? Our duty is obedience. And remember, Jesus said, hey, remember, you're still unprofitable or unworthy servants. So that, and you don't ask for thanks from God because you've done what it's your duty to do. So he reminds us of that, not too often, but
I think of that, the two sons, the father
The two
comes
sons,
and
absolutely.
says, I want you to go do out in the field and do this, and one son said, yeah, I'll do it, but he doesn't do it, and the other son said, no, I'm not going to do that, but then he does go out there.
what was the question? How did Jesus end that little parable? What was the ultimate question that he was after?
Who actually did the work?
Who actually did? So what Jesus is saying there is who actually obeyed. And I find it, I don't know. What does the Bible, what's the New Testament, or even the whole Bible, what does it talk about obedience? How important is it?
No.
Huge.
Very important.
I mean, it really is.
Number one.
Apart from faith, there's, I mean, because we don't obey ourselves into salvation. We trust God, but then, you know, what's the trust and obey? There's no other way, right? To be happy in Jesus.
And we like to split them, but they really are the same. We obey the gospel. In Romans, that talks about faith so much, he begins with obedience, and these people have not obeyed the gospel, and you've obeyed the gospel, and what is the work that we might work? This is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he has sent. So there's a sense in Jesus' mind that faith implies obedience, includes obedience. Who's the one who did his will? The one who did what he was told to do. So we often split those just because in our experience there is some, you know, I do believe, but I don't seem to obey sometimes. Well, if you do believe, you should be obeying. And if you don't believe, you're not going to obey.
Yep.
So we need to merge them a little tighter, maybe, in our thinking.
You know, one of the things why I brought up disciplines is that almost has a negative connotation, like a works connotation.
Yeah.
But I meant as disciplines as a fact of obedience. You know, just be obedient to being in the Word, obedient to studying the Word, obedient to hopefully following whatever the Holy Spirit is coming down. But obedience also takes discipline.
Oh, for sure.
So I mean, I was saying, not discipline in a negative sense that it's a legalism, but obedience in fact of what it needs. You have to have, you know, that discipline in order to have the obedience on the positive side.
And the obedience, in that sense, may be obedience from the heart, whereas legalism, again, Packer's understanding of legalism, he argues that legalism pulls the heart out of doing good things. The good things are good because they follow God's standard, they're motivated by love and the glory of God, and when you pull that out of your obedience, you've got legalism. You're mandating certain things to be done without the heart of obedience, without the heart of love for God, without the heart of glorifying God, so that the works without faith or the works without love for God are no good. So he says to the Pharisees, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and those are good, but you've neglected the weightier matters of love, of mercy, justice, humility, faith in God. It's the heart. You're doing good things. It's fine to tithe mint, but that's not going to cut it if you're not doing it out of love for God.
I'm a good person.
Yeah, if you're trying to prove that you're a good person, you've missed it.
Oftentimes what happens is, and we see this, you know, in the parable of the two sons, you know, the prodigal son in that sense, but what does the older brother say? I have done A, B, C, and D, and you've never given me a party.
Yeah.
And so, this is works, and then you're blessed. Works are equals blessing, or work, you do your works, but ultimately what we're kind of saying is, I do my works, and I have earned the right to be blessed. See, versus God says, hey, I bless you. Now in response to the blessing that I've given you, be obedient. out of love and gratitude. That's ultimately. But oftentimes, it's subtle that legalism comes in and we say, well, God's lucky to have me on his team because I'm such an obedient person, and therefore my obedience has earned me something, like the elder brother.
But there's balance in that versus priorities like seek first the kingdom of God and everything else we give unto you, right? So it's a matter of priorities too, right?
Yeah, oh certainly. But we never want to let that little subtle thing to say, you know what? I've been faithful, I've been good. I guess when God blessed me or something, I see a little quid pro quo
Little
here.
pride there, isn't there?
Pardon?
Little pride.
Could be, yeah. Better.
But
Absolutely.
the warning in the last days, Lord, Lord, look what I've done for you.
Yeah.
I did all these things in
They
your
whip
name.
out their resume.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
So-
and did they really know? Did they
I
really
never
have
knew
the
you.
heart?
I never
Yeah.
knew you. There wasn't a relationship there. There was these externals. Which again, I was reading. I was talking to somebody this week as well, and we were talking about like Orthodox Jewish people, and I'll make a reference later. But there was you read this material, and I'm on these emails for like the Temple Institute and the Temple Mount Faith, and these Jewish Orthodox people in Israel that want to build a temple, and so I get their emails with these devotions. And it was interesting as the devotion was on basically Deuteronomy, talking about Moses giving the law again and rehearsing and everything. The guy went down and he gave this short teaching, this rabbi, and I read it and I was like, there's nothing in here. If I would have slapped a different label of a title on there or a person, everyone would have been like, this is a great teaching. It's about obedience, it's about following God, it's about loving God, and I thought, wow, look at this. This is from an unbeliever. Somebody who is devoted to the God of Israel, but doesn't know the God of Israel. Well, am I being judgmental there? How do I know that? How do I know that this guy, as devoted as he is to the Torah, to the Bible, to the God of Israel, how do I know that it's false? He rejects Jesus. Jesus says, if you don't honor me,
You don't honor the Father.
yep, no one comes to the Father except through me. And so in the same way, all these religious things that sound wonderful don't measure up. With the same honor that you honor the Father, you need to honor the Son. I mean, those are Jesus' words. So these people are all living in a world of deception, but they sound good. And they're devoted, and they're committed. And a lot of times they're more obedient than people of real faith.
I have a Muslim coworker that likes to share her Quran devotions
Okay.
with me, and I find it really interesting. And so we talk about it, and it's the same thing. There was, if I didn't know, it was a Muslim devotional, and what it was, it's all those good things,
Yeah.
right?
Good things are good.
Without
It's good to do good
Jesus.
things, right?
And so, very interesting.
Yeah. Jesus really is the corner and the foundation
And therein
of all
lies
things.
that deception.
Yeah.
I think I'm good.
I was I was listening and working with a doctor in Houston. There were a number of docs in our group that were Jewish, and there was all this mix. There were Reform Jews, there were conservative Jews, there were Orthodox Jews. One guy was Orthodox, and he was Orthodox. And I said to him, and this is a common question among Jews, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it really mean? I used to go to seminars at Rice with Jewish students. They sit around for hours arguing about what does it mean to be Jewish.
Oh,
Nobody really
absolutely.
knew what it meant to be Jewish. And I said, what does it mean to be Jewish? He said, to keep the Sabbath. That's the essence. If you don't keep the Sabbath, and by that, you live close, you never walk, you don't drive your car, you keep the Sabbath.
Rules.
And I thought, that's really, for an Orthodox Jew, he'd done this all his life to keep the Sabbath. And I said to him, what if the Sabbath is not a day? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, what if the Sabbath means we cease from our own efforts and our own labors, and we yield our lives and we rest in God, and He is our everything, and we live our lives for His glory, not doing things that we want to do, but yielding to Him. And he paused and was like, he said, no, that can't be.
Can't be.
That can't be.
Why?
It has
Why?
to be.
Why
It has
can't
to
it
be.
be? Because no rabbi has ever said that before.
I didn't go on and argue with him about it, but it was like,
Rock his
what
world.
could that possibly? No.
No.
They can't
It
think for
has to
themselves.
be. It has to be these rules because all these other guys are not good
Because
kids.
the Talmud
They don't-
tells me.
They don't walk to Sabbath. And I thought, how
And
interesting.
I like what Paul in Colossians, he's countering that. He says, these are shadows, including all the feasts and the Sabbath days. Colossians 2. He says these are shadows. The substance is Christ. So all these, another question is, well, that weekly Sabbath that God gave you, very much an identifying marker in the book of Exodus. This is the sign of the covenant, was the Sabbath. What was that pointing to? What do you think that was pointing to? And it's pointing to Hebrews, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews 4, the rest. So all the feasts, the Sabbaths, all of them were pointing to something. The sacrifices were pointing. They were a shadow. And you think, even the Sabbath, what was God trying to ingrain in your mind every week about having the joy of ceasing? Because the word Shabbat, it means to cease. What do you think he was getting at? You think he was really only interested in you ceasing from these physical things, or was it pointing, everything's a spiritual lesson, right? Was it pointing to something better? But here, I think it's important for us as we wrap up the Screwtape letters, is some of the things that we're getting at is imbalance. And we've talked about spiritual imbalance, theological imbalance. We've also talked about the contrast often between faith and feelings, getting us, and we'll see this over and over, Screwtape is always trying to get us to rely on our feelings or even our experience. See, these are great. They're part of who we are. But do we rely on them? That's the danger. And it's interesting in Peter, we'll get there more next week, but he talks about his experience. And one of the things that he says is, today's message is talking about being established in these truths. That's why he's like, hey, you've been established in these truths, and we're going to talk about a variety of things. And one of the contrasts is I find it fascinating. He says, hey, I'm going to remind you of these things. You've been established in these truths. That's great. What truths? Well, we'll talk about that. So the question is what establishes us? Is it truth or experience? And we want to say, well, it's the truth. God's word is eternal word, not experience. But then in the next phrase, he says, well, let me tell you about what I experienced. Okay? And he goes into his experience. But then he says, hey, and that's the next one, is, well, we have something better, even more sure than experience. What? Bottom line. The prophetic word. So it's interesting how he's truth, and he says, well, let me tell you about my experience, but he immediately catches himself to say, yeah, and that might be true. I have these experiences, but we have something even more sure. Than what? Than all these right here, which is this. And that's where we're going to wrestle, and we'll see that today. But one of the things that what this connects to is, again, in summary, truth versus feelings, etc. But also at the end of the day is obedience. We obey, we do our duty apart from how we feel, because that is a great, that letter 8, man, when we obey, when we don't even want to, we don't see God anywhere, Screwtape is running for cover. It's like, man, I have lost. Because that is ultimately, and as we know, it comes over here. It ultimately is faith. And we know Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And that's really, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So, he goes on, against this disaster, right? He's obeying now in the midst of all this. Against this disaster, all you can produce on the credit side is a burst of ill temper with a dog that tripped him up, some excessive cigarette smoking, and the forgetting of a prayer. What is the use of whining to me about your difficulties if you are proceeding on the enemy's idea of justice and suggesting that your opportunities and intentions should be taken into account? Then I am not sure that a charge of heresy does not lie against you. At any rate, you will soon find that the justice of hell is purely realistic and concerned only with results. Bring us back food, or be food yourself. Now this, so, enemy's idea of justice, what Screwtape is, or what C.S. Lewis is leading here is two things. That our opportunities and our intentions, or our motives, should be taken into account. Are they? Does God look at us on that day when we stand before the judgment seat and we get our rewards that are not earned but that are graciously given in response to the feeble efforts of that we've offered Him? Okay, we'll remember that. It's not earned. And one of the things I put on here was, let's see, question 2. What is the enemy's idea of justice that Screwtape loathes? And I gave 2 passages there, both in 1 Corinthians 3. One is just, the passage about wood, hay, and stubble. On that day, all of our works we put out, the works that don't measure up, for whatever reason, we don't know, they'll burn up. But then there's going to be other works that survive the fire, and then we will get our reward. But what I like is 1 Corinthians 4, where, and we've gone through this before, but just as a reminder, where Paul writes that don't judge anybody's motives before the time. Because on that day, God will reveal to us, even ourselves, our own motives. Because Paul says, hey, sometimes I didn't even know my own motives or why I do things. So certainly don't judge somebody else's motives. But what that tells me is that God is looking at the intentions. He's looking at the opportunities. That is part of God's standard of justice, which I find consistent. Contrast is hell's justice is purely realistic. All it's interested in is results. They don't care how you get there.
Well, okay, so, but if you think about Satan's justice, it's kind of a form of legalism in the sense that it has no grace, no love, no mercy.
It's law.
It's black and white, right? So that's why he's the accuser, right? Because what he's saying, that he didn't verbalize this, but in a sense, when I've argued with non-believers, they've argued that Satan's high ground is the fact that he's simply black and white, and that God cheated by sending His Son and offering His grace. Because grace is a wild card to pure justice. So Satan's justice is, in one sense, more just than God's. That's their argument. God cheated.
On a technicality.
On a technicality, we're allowed him to heaven because he punished his own son. So Satan's argument is, I'm more righteous because
I can see
I'm
that
black
for sure.
and white. And that's where legalism plays into our fallen nature, because then we can be more righteous than people living under grace.
So when Satan is standing and he finally is getting judged way after the millennium in Revelation 20, is he going to cry foul?
I don't think so. I think he will.
He may do.
I could go either way. He might be so so filled with pride that he says, "Give it to me, let me have it. I dare you," And at that moment, or he could cry foul and say, "You've been unjust, you've been unfair. You let those rascals off, but you didn't let me off." And or he might just be bold and say, "You know what? Give it to me right on the chin," in pride. I take your pick. Either way. But what we do know, I like you bringing that up, is that we do know in Revelation 12, right? Satan is the accuser of the brethren. And you see this in Romans 8. We read it last week. Is any of, if we get an accusation against us, against the elect, will it stick? Not when the judge has been bought off on a technicality, right?
It's a legal transaction.
It's a legal transaction.
It is.
He says, you bring all your accusations you want. I already paid the bill. It's been paid for. No one's denying the sin, but the payment is made. The debt has been paid in that regard. And the judge, we got the inside corner on that because of God's doing. Let's keep going in paragraph 2. He says, the only constructive passage in your letter is where you say that you still expect good results from the patient's fatigue. So this is where we start getting into fatigue. That is well enough. But it won't fall into your hands. Fatigue can produce 3 things: extreme gentleness, quiet of mind, and even something like a vision. If you have often seen men led by it into anger, malice, and impatience, that is because those men had efficient tempters. So here you have fatigue can be extremely gentle. You're just too tired, quiet of mind, and then you're kind of, maybe hallucinating or whatever. Something like a vision, or you have this, your body's so tired that you're kind of not thinking straight. So that's one aspect. The other one is, if you have an efficient tempter, there's no doubt fatigue can go into anger, malice, and impatience. And we saw that in letter 21 about irritability. So again, he's bringing it up again. He says the paradoxical thing, what's paradoxical? That's a good word. What's a paradox?
Opposites.
Contradiction.
A seeming contradiction.
Seeming
It's not a real one,
Okay.
but it seems like one. And so the Bible has a lot of paradoxes in it. Does it have any real contradictions? I've never found a single one. But it has a lot of paradoxes. They seem like it, but upon further scrutiny, you'll realize, no, I guess if we pull out all of the rules of logic, there isn't a single contradiction. Okay? He says, the paradoxical thing is that moderate fatigue is better soul for peevishness or irritability than absolute exhaustion. Okay? This seems odd, right? This seems contradictory, but in reality, and I can see how what he just said, is that if you're absolutely exhausted, you're just too tired to be irritated. And you're like, forget it. But if there's a moderate, you still have enough energy left to be angry or irritated. All right? He says, this depends partly on physical causes, but partly on something else. It is not fatigue simply, as such, that produces the anger, okay, but unexpected demands on a man already tired. And we don't want to recount all of letter 21, but this is letter 21. Remember? Why did we get irritated from letter 21? Do you remember this? Give me some encouragement that we remember. What did we remember? What made us irritable or peevish in letter 21?
Fatigue.
No.
Nice try.
That's kind of.
You know, it's good that I
Time for points.
don't get discouraged.
Now, wait, let's put it
I was
in
gone that
context. How many weeks ago was
No,
that?
I wasn't asking that question.
That's like 18 weeks ago. Plus you, because you were gone. So.
That's right. My time is what?
Oh, that's right.
Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
There's an entitlement there. My time is my own, and I had this whole morning planned, and then somebody walked into my office, and they want to talk.
Sheesh.
Yep. And then I think,
That's never happened.
yeah, never happened. And so when we start thinking that my
Selfish.
it's selfish, we start, instead of realizing my time is my own, it's the Lord's time. So if the Lord's bringing somebody in, or whatever that may be, again, I can't become irritable because I'm the Lord's slave. And so remember, he talked about if all the Lord asked me to do was listen to one person talk for 30 minutes, then I should be happy because the Lord could have us do everything else. But if we have the proper perspective that my time is the Lord's time, because I don't, remember, what do we own? Nothing. We're stewards of everything, right? So that gets into this, but these unexpected demands on a man are retired. Whatever men expect, okay, that's the key, they soon come to think they have a right to, which is what we talked about in letter 21. The sense of disappointment can, with very little skill on our part, be turned into a sense of injury. Again, this is all, I'm disappointed because I had these expectations of my time and it was interrupted. And this is all rehearsal of letter 21. He says, this injury. It is after men have given in to the irremediable or irreparable, after they have despaired of relief, and they have ceased to think even a half hour ahead, that the dangers of a humbled and gentle weariness begin. So think about, what's he saying here? It is after men have given into the irreparable, after they have despaired of relief, and they've ceased to think even a half hour ahead, that the dangers of humbled and gentle weariness begin.
Mm-hmm.
What's he saying there?
You know you can't do anything. You are beyond it. You realize you're at the end of yourself,
Yep.
100%, and you just can't do it, and you relinquish yourself to that.
The what do we call that? There's a word I was thinking of.
You're at the end of your rock bottom, is what
Right.
we call it.
We become resigned. Not in the sense of I'm putting in a resignation, but you know what? What do we have here?
Well,
He
I
has-
can't do anything.
Give it up.
It's irrecoverable. I can't fix it.
Right.
Nobody's gonna help me.
I've despaired of relief. Yep, no one's there to help. And secondly, or third, I'm so resigned that I don't even think a half hour ahead. Now think about it in the context of war, as an example of being bombed. That's really what he's talking about. So when a person's resigned, let's talk about this for a second. Is resignation good or bad?
It depends.
On what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The attitude with it
Okay.
and what you're resigning yourself to.
Okay? That's the key. So resignation is always to something.
To God's will.
Okay? That's good. To God's will.
And to his mercy
To his mercy.
and his sovereignty.
You guys are too spiritual.
What about his authority?
I agree with
To
you.
despair. To despair. How about that?
Oftentimes, what are we resigned to? I think you're right.
Hopelessness.
Despair.
Oh,
We
yeah.
have a pity
We
party.
could go that direction.
That's
Right?
a good one.
We're martyrs. Woe is me. So, but we try to wrap it in, well, in reality, I'm just submitting and resigning to God's ultimate will
Right.
here.
Well,
But in reality, I'm over here whining about it.
Yeah.
I'm having a pity party.
Yeah.
But that's why I said you guys are too spiritual. Given, and I hope that's what you guys are all thinking. Is, well, I'm resigned ultimately to God, okay, and what He wants, what He's doing, and that's why I said it could go both ways. Resignation in a situation, maybe it's a disease, and you say, you know, Lord, Your will be done, not mine, and we're resigned, and that doesn't necessarily mean we stop praying for healing. But regardless, we have committed the outcome to His sovereign decision.
And I think peace comes with that.
That exactly,
You know.
and that's what Screwtape is trying to avoid, is this resignation to God and all the promises and that peace. And instead, he recognizes, well, hey, wait a minute. There's this. He's fatigued. He's resigned. This humble and gentle weariness is beginning, but let's corrupt that. That's the physical things, because he's recognized, I can't stop the war, man. I'm so tired. It's irrecoverable. No one's going to rescue me in this situation. I have to do my duty, and I can't even think half hour ahead. I'm just thinking for the moment, right? And we saw that in again also in letter 14 about humility. That what he was doing there was, he says, Wormwood, this is horrible. He's not making any grand promises. He's not making any plans how he's going to be this super Christian, you know, in a year from now. This is horrible. The man has become humble. And what he's doing in humility or resignation is he's relying not even on the grace for tomorrow, he's relying on God's provision of grace for the hour.
Yeah. The moment.
The moment.
Yeah.
And so you see this consistency, which he can't even think a half hour ahead. He says, to produce the best results from the patient's fatigue, therefore, you must feed him with false hopes. What do false hopes do? What do false hopes include? I guess I'll say it this way. We have false...
Expectations.
Yes! False hopes is another way to say expectations. Okay? I'll just...
And they, well, I'll let you read it first.
No, go ahead. I don't
We
mind.
haven't read it yet.
Oh, go read it.
Well, do you want me to read it?
Yeah, sure. I don't need to talk all the time.
Do you want me to read?
Yeah, sure.
Number 3, paragraph 3. I was reading ahead.
Oh, you were reading ahead. Okay. Oh, I see what you're saying.
I was like, I'll wait till we get there.
So, he says, put into his mind plausible reasons. Plausible, right? For believing that the air raid will not be repeated. Keep comforting himself with thought, remember, mind, and now he's trying to put into his mind the thoughts of how much he will enjoy his bed the next night. Exaggerate, there's out of balance, right? The weariness by making him think it will soon be over. For men usually feel that a strain could not have been endured no longer at the very moment when it is ending, or when they think it is ending. In this fatigue, I guess, as in the problem of cowardice, the thing to avoid is the total commitment. Whatever he says, let his inner resolution be not to bear whatever comes to him, but to bear it for a reasonable period. And let the reasonable period be shorter than the trial is likely to last. And I like this last one. This is kind of what you were saying, Letter. It need not be much shorter. In attacks on patience, chastity, or fortitude, what's fortitude? Yeah, your strength, your perseverance, all those together. In attacks on those, your patience, your long-suffering, the fun is to make the man yield just when, had he but known it, relief was almost in sight. This is rich, in that there's two things here. That there's the angle of putting into his mind these expectations. But where do these expectations come from?
Plausible.
Plausible.
Deep in the
And
heart.
what
Deep
really
in the heart.
stood out to me is that they all hinged on an improvement in a situation. And sometimes our situation doesn't improve until heaven. And that's the part where I see, like they're saying, he's like, just make the period long enough. And some people, life is hard and it's suffering for a lot of people for a lot of time, but there's heaven coming. And we lose sight of that. And that's the part that reminds me of, is that things may not improve here ever.
And one of the things that you see here is put into his mind. What you have is, where did these things come from? From himself.
Yep.
From his own mind. These plausible things. So we're looking, any of us who could be in a situation, we start thinking, well, all right, Lord, I'm resigned to the fact that I'm in this trial or temptation. And we're resigned to it, but then we start thinking, how long can I last? Well, if the Lord does A, B, C, D, or whatever, and then we start thinking of ways in which, well, I can last this long, or I can last this long. And then when they don't come, we get disappointed. That's what he's after here, too. I think about the parable of the soils in Matthew 13 and other passages where tribulation comes and they walk away. You know, persecution comes because of the word and they venture on. So for that person, they said, I will follow Jesus, or I will stay committed to the plan. I will be totally committed up until this point. And then you begin to wonder, well, were they really saved? I mean, that's God's business, but we do wonder.
Justin Peters is a pastor, master seminary graduate, and he has a ministry exposing the word of faith and some of the prosperity gospel people and all these faith healers. The reason he's so passionate about it, when he was a young man, he's suffering, I think, from cerebral palsy or some kind of birth defect. He was under the same thing. His neighbor would take him to a faith healer or a tent revival, and either they're going to heal you, this, that, and the other. He'd get his hopes up, and you can imagine, living like Anna Rose said, this is a lifetime of suffering that this man's going to go through. And he's going to have to persevere. But when he was a young man, you can imagine how he could have lost his faith. And he probably did, and he was probably angry at God for a while. But his ministry now is to expose these people who are giving this false hope and just crushing people's faith. Is that if people are putting their faith, moving from God and into these faith healers, it's tragic. I can imagine many people reject their faith after failed faith healings and stuff.
Here's kind of a trick question. I like those. Is healing guaranteed and part of the gospel?
After this life.
After this life, it's a timing thing.
It's a timing thing.
Absolutely.
Because we see that in Matthew 8. Jesus heals somebody, and Matthew writes, this is in fulfillment of Isaiah 53, by his stripes we are healed. Well, and some scholars will say, well, Isaiah 53, that passage, is about spiritual healing. It's not about physical healing. And I go, well, hold on a minute there. I would agree that that's the context, no doubt. Sins, your soul is saved, all of Isaiah 53. And then it says, by your stripes we are healed. And in that context of Isaiah 53, even though the stripes were physical, it would be hard for me to exegetically walk away with bringing physical healing in there. Okay? But when Matthew writes it as an inspired writer, that settles it for me, right? He wrote it by the Holy Spirit. This is in fulfillment of Isaiah 53. But So then, that is a lot of times how the gospel or the faith healers, they'll use that. And I'll say, hey, wait a minute. It is guaranteed, but it's about timing. Because what we do know is sometimes God says, not in this life, but in the next life, absolutely. The lame will leap, right? The blind will see, 100% guaranteed, everybody. And so the person who was blind in this life or lame, that on that day, they get a new body, they get new eyes. That's because of Isaiah 53. That's because Jesus paid for that healing. But it's not necessarily, God sometimes will show grace, extra grace, if he, according to his grace is his to give as he wants. And he might show it in this life and bring the healing. But if he doesn't,
It's God's timing. I always
God's
say God's
timing.
timing is perfect.
but it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
It's just the timing.
Bill Johnson from Bethel fame in Redding, California, his twist isn't necessarily Isaiah 53. It's in the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, thy will be done on earth as it is heaven. So he's bringing heaven down and saying that God's will for healing is in the here and now. And he runs a miracle college or whatever
Of course.
whatever
Yeah.
that thing
Oh, yeah,
is. You
the
know,
Course of
he has
Miracles.
all these young, well, kind of like that, but I can't remember the name of it.
Dust in the hair.
What's that?
Did you see the thing where they put like gold sparkles in
Gives
the
them
hair?
heating ducts, and they said it's glory dust, and yeah, I mean, he's quite a showman. But he's got a lot of young men and women enrolling in his college here. I ran into one Friday night who came and
Really?
prophesied over me and said he thought I was a hard worker and this, that, and the other, and I had an interesting chat with this young man. And it's full of zeal. You love these young men and women. You're trying to point them to a higher understanding of Scripture, but they're sitting under someone who's teaching that, and that's problematic, obviously.
Because, we have to be, again, balanced, right? Because when Jesus sends, either the 12 or the 70 out, and what does he say? Go out and preach the gospel. What does he say? Heal the sick. Raise the dead. Proclaim.
What was that?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that that's not part of the gospel, because according to Isaiah 61, it is part of the gospel.
The gospel.
But what we recognize is God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. In all of it. We come and we to me, when I look at, if I'm going to pray for somebody that needs healing, I'm going to say, Lord, by your stripes are real. I'm going to be bold, but I'm also going to be submitted to the timing of God's sovereignty. Because who am I to know what God's sovereign plan is and all of it? But it's not, I think, I would have probably maybe a gentle criticism, not so much of us, but of the church in general, that we probably don't pray enough for healing. We've come to the other side. We want to stay away from the word, faith, prosperity, that whole imbalance, and we've come pendulum and swung over here, where we just say, well, but in reality, again, Matthew 8 just sticks to my mind. It says very clear, this is part of the gospel, and you see them going out. But as long as we do it in a way that is, again, humble and open to God's timing on it, for sure. That's the balance. But
And maybe in light of where their faith is too. I've been so impressed and so blessed, with people that have chronic pain. Like Johnny Erickson, my wife has chronic pain. I remember one day I said, well, I'll pray that you have less pain today. And she said, I'll have less pain when I go to heaven. So that may be a prayer to shorten my life. Pray rather that I have grace today. Accept the pain.
Great answer.
And I'm like, for me, I haven't had as much pain as some of these people have had, and I just am amazed. I hear Johnny Erickson, and many of these people with chronic pain, they're just praising God, and they're not expecting the pain to go away. They're expecting God, and just like this, Screwtape is telling them, just tell them, you have to have a reasonable amount of pain. Well, these people are saying, my reasonable amount of pain is I'm going to be in pain all my life, and so they're not disappointed. They're trusting God. This guy, and me too, when I have pain, I'm expecting, God, you better heal us pretty quick, because I can't take this much longer. But their faith is just the opposite. It's a faith that goes on right through the time and trusts.
what I find too is, and this is again, a gentle criticism the church in general, is that, you know, whether it's oftentimes you come to a prayer meeting and, hey, you got any prayer requests? What's 80% of the prayers?
I have a procedure this Thursday.
I have an aunt that needs healing. You know, or you know, I'm in pain or whatever. My toes swelled up. You know, and I think, okay, well, again, it's not wrong, right? It's not wrong to pray for those things. God wants to hear all of our heart. But oftentimes, what I don't hear is, Lord, your will be done, and may I have the grace to submit in the midst of this and to bring God glory and honor in the midst of this trial. And may it last as long as it needs to last, according to whatever he's trying to teach me. But may his grace be sufficient.
Right. Well, that's why the missionaries don't pray, you know, out of persecution. Because, you know, the persecution is forwarding the gospel.
You see that in Acts 4, right? Peter and them got beaten. He says, give us boldness. He didn't pray for that to be removed necessarily. And again, the key is balance in all this is that we don't want to get sucked into either side. That we should still pray, but in the midst of it, we say, nevertheless, your will be done, not mine, and may the grace be given to me in the moment and the hour so that I can still be faithful.
Doesn't that look like I often think I want to give a prayer disclaimer. You know, come up to someone, can you pray for my elbow or whatever, and say, I'm going to pray, but you know, it may or may not work, and God's timing, blah, 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 and then pray. But then that looks like double-mindedness, faithlessness, because a lot of what you see in Scripture is, you know, pray with faith and believe it. You know, believe your prayer, so on and so forth. So the paradox of that is a challenge.
Well, who's the best example of all of this? Jesus. Lord,
take this cup from me.
Take this cup. That was a prayer, but not my will, your will. I mean, if Jesus can do it and not have it be double-minded, he did pray to have it, and that was a genuine prayer.
Sure.
But he also recognized the submission on the other part as it relates to timing, that he would be delivered. It would just happen to be, 3.5 days later.
He obeyed to death.
Even death on a cross.
Even death.
And I
To
think
the point of death. Yeah.
God answers prayer to help reach that person a lot of times. Like we discussed how early in life sometimes these prayers are answered.
Yeah.
So it makes God real to these people.
Yeah.
I remember when we were working in Benevolence Ministries, I prayed for that if they answered their prayers, that it was a sign that God wants to have a personal relationship with them. And I was surprised how many people came back and said, yeah, I said, now this is a sign that you really should accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And it's surprising, I don't know what will happen, whether there's any of those going to be in heaven, but it's kind of neat because you saw some of those prayers answered.
I've seen that in my own life. But how soon is it that God reminds us that he's not a genie in the sky?
Oh, right away.
Right? I'm not just your genie that when you want something. For years. And then the miracle does come. The healing does come. Other times it doesn't. But nevertheless, help us to continue to be balanced. Help us to realize as well that it is our duty to obey and to follow you and to walk by faith, even when we don't see anything. And even when we don't feel your presence or we feel forsaken by you. May all of us continue in our intention to be obedient because that's an act of faith. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.